Fifth Sunday after Epiphany. O Lord, we pray, keep your church and household continually in thy true religion, that they who do lean only upon the hope of your heavenly grace may evermore be defended by your mighty power. Amen. Well, let's see here. We have a hymn from John Damascus of the 8th century. Thou hallowed, chosen, morn of praise, that blessed and greatest shinest fair, Easter, queen of all the days, of seasons best, divinest, Christ rose from death, and we adore forever and forevermore. That was better than that 20th century ditty, the hymn before. I can't believe the one before made it in hymn book, some 20th century enthusiast. Well, we're in Dr. Adolph von Harnack's Volume 5. This was published in 1899. The volume deals with the epoch-making service of Augustine as reformer of Christian piety and as a theological teacher, and with the influence exercised down to the period of the Carlovingian Renaissance. The following volume will complete the history and development of dogma by telling the story of medieval theology. The concluding volume will treat of the main issues of dogma in the period since the Reformation. A.B. Bruce, I think he was from Edinburgh, as memory serves. Preface to the first edition. We're going to be in the Middle Ages. Okay, the exposition of Augustine, Anselm, Thomas, and the Council of Trent, Socinianism, and Luther rest throughout on independent studies. December 1889. Okay, he's got a rather lengthy another preface, but I'm not. Probably should have read this, but Adolph von Harnack, 1897. It says he spent a lot of time on the table of contents. Part 2, development of ecclesiastical dogma, historical situation, Augustine till the period of the Reformation. Wow. Augustine, Western Christianity, Christian piety, dogma, Middle Ages, German and Roman people, dogma, Western Christianity, Tertullian, heuristic element, Cyprian's importance, the Roman Church. Going back through some of the old period here. Historical position of Augustine as reformer, pre-Augustinianism. Chapter 4, historical position of Augustine as a teacher. Donatism. Pelagian controversy. History of dogma in the West down to the beginning of the Middle Ages, 430 to 604. Interesting how he defines that. Gregory the Great, history of dogma in the period of the Carlovingian Renaissance, adoption controversy, Spanish affairs, dispute between Frankish and Roman tribunals, Alcuin's teaching, connection with the Lord's Supper, controversy about predestination, Gottschalk, Rabanus, Ratramnus, his opponents, objective untruthfulness Gottschalk's opponents, the Synod of Valencia, Filioque, images, the theory of the Mass, Augustinian conception promoted by Beda, checked by Alcuin, Pascus Radbertus, Rabanus, and Ratramnus, practice of confession. Is that the end of it? Development of ecclesiastical dogma, second book. Expansion and remodeling of dogma into a doctrine of sin, grace, and means of grace. Domini mors potentiar erat quam vita, lex Christianorum crux est sancta Christi. Historical situation. The history and piety and of dogmas in the West was so thoroughly dominated by Augustine from the beginning of the 5th century to the era of the Reformation that we must take this whole time as forming one period. It is indeed, that's a big statement. It is indeed possible to doubt whether it is not correct to include also the succeeding period, since Augustinianism continued to exert its influence in the 16th century. But we're compelled to prefer the views that the Reformation had all the significance of a new movement, and that the revolt from Augustine was marked even in post-Tridentine Catholicism, as well as completely in Socinianism. In the second book of the second section, therefore, we regard the history of dogma of the West from Augustine to the Reformation as one complete development, and then in accordance with our definition of dogma and its history, we had the final stages of dogma in their triple form: Tridentine Catholicism, Socinianism, and Protestantism. In order rightly to appreciate the part played by Augustine, it is necessary first to describe the distinctive character of Western Christianity and Western theologians. Got a footnote: the complete breach with Augustine is indeed marked neither by Luther nor Ignatius Loyola, but first by Leibniz, Thomasius, and the probabilists of the 17th and 18th centuries. So we're talking about Western theology anterior to its appearance. It will then appear that while the West was prepared to favor Augustinianism, those very elements that characterize Western Christianity, the juristic and moralistic, big statements, resisted the Augustinian thought in matters of faith. This fact at once foreshadows the later history of Augustinianism in the Church. Augustine comes before us in the first place as a reformer of Christian piety, altering much that belonged to vulgar Catholicism and carrying out monotheism strictly and thoroughly. He gave the central place to the living relation of the soul to God. He took religion out of the sphere of cosmology and cultus and demonstrated and cherished it in the domain of the deepest life of the soul. On the other hand, we will have to show that while establishing the sovereignty of faith over all that is natural, he did not surmount the old Catholic foundation of the theological mode of thought. Further, that he was not completely convinced of the supremacy of the religious over the moral, the personal state of faith over ecclesiasticism. And finally, that in his religious tendencies, as general, he remained burdened by the rubbish of ecclesiastical tradition. Nice shot, Adolph. I'm glad I read everything Augustine's written myself more than once. That's quite a statement by Adolph. Augustine falls next to be considered as a Christian teacher, the union of three great circles of thought, which he reconstructed and connected absolutely, assured him, along with the incomparable impression made by his inexhaustible personality, of a lasting influence. In the first place, he built up a complete circle of conceptions, which is marked by the categories: God, the soul, alienation from God, irresistible grace, hunger for God, unrest in the world, and rest in God and felicity. A circle in which we can easily demonstrate the cooperation of Neoplatonic and monastic Christian elements, but which is really so pure and simple that it can be taken as the fundamental form of a monotheistic piety in general. Secondly, he gave expression to a group of ideas in which sin, grace through Christ, grace in general, faith, love, and hope form the main points. A Paulinism modified by popular Catholic elements. Thirdly, he constructed another group in which the Catholic Church is regarded as authority, dispenser of grace, and administrator of the sacraments, and further as the means and aims of all God's ordinances. Here he always constructed, along with the wealth of ideas, a profusion of schemes, not formulas. He refashioned dogmatics proper, and speaking generally, gave the first impulse to a study which is an introduction of dogmatics, obtained such an immense importance for theology and science since the scholastics. Which volume are we on here? Is it volume 5? Yeah, we're on volume 5. On the other hand, Augustine always felt that he was, as regards dogma, an epigon, and he submitted himself absolutely to the tradition of the church. He submitted himself to the scriptures. Adolph, come on. He was wanting in the vigorous energy in the church work shown by Athanasius, and in the impulse to force upon the church in fixed formulas the truths that possessed his soul. Consequently, the result of his life work on behalf of the church can be described. He established more securely in the West the ancient ecclesiastical tradition as authority and law. He deepened and, comparatively speaking, Christianized the old religious tendency. 3, in the thought and life of the church, he substituted a plan of salvation along with an appropriate doctrine of the sacraments for the old dogma and cultus, and instilled into heart and feeling the fundamental conception of his Christianity, that divine grace was the beginning, middle, and end. He himself sought to harmonize the conception with popular Catholicism, and he expressed this in formulas which, because they were not fixed and definite, admitted of still further concessions to traditional views. In a word, he failed to establish without admixture the new and higher religious style in which he constructed theology. Therefore, the ancient Greek dogma, which was aimed at deification, as well as the old Roman conception of religion as a legal relationship, could maintain their ground side by side. Precisely in the best of his gifts to the church, Augustine gave it impulses and problems, but not a solid capital. Along with this, he transmitted to posterity a profusion of ideas, conceptions, and views. Footnote 1. The ancient dogma has thus formed building material in the West since Augustine. It has been deprived, at least in its most important respect, of its ancient purpose and serves new ones. The stones hewn for a temple and once constructed into a temple now serve for the building of a cathedral. Or perhaps the figure is more appropriate, that the old temple expanded into a cathedral. At the beginning of the history of the Latin Church, Cyprian followed Tertullian and stamped the character of ancient Latin Christianity. So Gregory the Great succeeded Augustine and gave expression to the medieval character of Latin Christianity, a form which, under Augustinian formulas, often differs in whole and in details from Augustine. Dogma remains almost throughout the Middle Ages, the complex of Trinitarian and Christological doctrines, which was handed down with the symbol. But besides this, an immense series of theological conceptions of church regulations and statutes already possessed a quasi-dogmatic authority, yet in acute cases could alone be expelled as a heretic, who could be convicted of disbelieving one of the 12 articles of the symbol or of sharing in the doctrines of heretics already rejected, Pelagians, Donatists. Thus it remained up to the time of the Reformation, although the doctrines of the Church, the Pope, the sacraments and ecclesiastical sacrament of penance and doctrine of transubstantiation claimed almost dogmatic authority, though only by being artificially connected with the symbol. The consolidation of the ecclesiastical and dogmatic system into a legal order in harmony with the genius of Western Christianity. What is this genius? Was almost rendered perfect by the political history of the church in the period of the tribal migrations. The Germans who entered the circle of the church and partly became fused with the Latins, partly but under the leadership of Rome, remained independent, received Christianity in its ecclesiastical form as something absolutely complete. Therefore, setting aside the chauvinistic contention that the Germans were predisposed to Christianity, Seeberg, Dogma has repeated it. We got Reinhold Seeberg coming up. The only thing that disposes anybody to Christianity is God himself. No German Christianity existed in the Middle Ages in the sense that there was a Jewish, Greek, or Latin form. Germans may have attempted to make themselves more thoroughly familiar with Latin Christianity. For example, the Slavs did with the Greek. We may recall the old Saxon harmony of the Gospels. There's a complete absence of any independence in consciously appropriating it up to the settlement of the begging orders in Germany, properly speaking, up to the Reformation. Complaints of papal oppressions or of external ceremonies cannot be introduced into this question. The complainers were themselves Roman Christians, and the never-failing sectaries paid homage not to a German Christianity, but to a form of the church which was also imported. If up to the 13th century there existed in Germany no independent theology or science, still less was there any movement in the history of dogma. But as soon as Germans in Germany and England took up an independent part in the inner movement of the church, they prepared the way, supported indeed by Augustine, for the Reformation. The case was different on Roman territory. We need not, of course, look at Italy, for the land of the Pope steadily maintained its characteristic indifference to all theology as theology. Well, I'm sure that's going to go over well. Apocalyptic, socialistic, and revolutionary movements were not wanting. Hippocrates and Justinian were studied, but the ideals of thinkers seldom interested Italians. Tell it to Aquinas. or Benedictines. Only can you get this out of a damn German? Excuse my French. I get too tired of that little country, little old Adolph. Little old Adolph telling us, oh boy. Reminds me of old Rudy Boltman somewhere up there. I was looking for it yesterday. He's up there telling us that nothing good came out of Germany or came out of England. Gotta just read that again. But the ideals of thinkers seldom interested Italians, and they hardly ever troubled themselves about dogma if it was nothing more. Spain also very soon passed out of the intellectual movement, into which, besides, it had never thrown any energy. Tell that to Isidore of Seville. For 8 centuries it was set the immense practical task of protecting Christendom from Islam. Well, I could see that. You got those guys breathing down your throat. In this war, it transformed the law of Catholic religion into a military discipline. The Spanish history of dogma has been a blank since the days of Bishop Elipandus. Nietzsche in the Deutsche Geschichte. Up to the middle of the 11th century, the task of administering property was more important to the German church than the political and dogmatic debates of the neighboring French hierarchy. See also Dollinger. Thus, France remains alone insofar as the Middle Ages down to the 13th century possessed any dogmatic history. It was to a very large extent Frankish or French. Gaul had been the land of culture among Latin countries as early as the 4th and 5th centuries. Amidst the storms of tribal migrations, culture maintained its ground longest in southern Gaul. After a short epoch of barbarism, during which civilization seemed to have died out everywhere on the continent, and England appeared to have obtained the leadership, France under the Carlovingians, of course. France, allied with Rome through Boniface, came to the front. There it remained, but with its center of gravity in the north, between the Seine and the Rhine. Paris was for centuries only second to Rome, as formerly Alexandria and Carthage had been. The imperial crown passed to the Germans. The real ruler of the world sat at Rome, but the studium, in every sense of the term, belonged to the French. Strictly speaking, even in France, there was no history of dogma in the Middle Ages. If the Reformation had not taken place, we would have been as little aware of any medieval history of dogma in the West as in the East. For the theological and ecclesiastical movements of the Middle Ages, which by no means profess to be new, dogmatic efforts only claim to be received into the history of dogma because they ended in the dogmas of Trent on the one hand and the symbols of the Reformed churches and Socinian rationalism on the other. The whole of the Middle Ages represents itself in the sphere of dogmatic history as a transition period, the period when the church was fixing its relationship to Augustine and the numerous impulses originated by him. This period lasted so long because the centuries had to elapse before Augustine found disciples worthy of him, and men were in a position even to understand the chain of ecclesiastical and theological edicts. Footnote 1, see the correct opinion of Jordanus of Osnabrück about 1285, that the Romans had received the sacerdotium, the Germans the imperium, the French the studium. See on the importance of the northeast France. sown in something. Because the Roman genius of the Western Church and the Augustinian spirit were in part ill-assorted, it was therefore a huge task to harmonize them. Because at the time when complete power had been gained for the independent study of church doctrine, and Augustine, a new authority in many respects more congenial to the spirit of the church, appeared on the scene, Augustine's powerful rival, Aristotle. The Roman genius, the superstition which, descending from the closing period of antiquity, was strengthened in barbarous times, Augustine and Aristotle. These are the four powers which contended for their interpretation of the gospel in the history of dogma, the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages experienced no dogmatic decisions like those of Nicaea or Chalcedon. After the condemnation of the Pelagians and semi-Pelagians, monothelites and adoptions, the dogmatic circle was closed. The actions in the Carlovingian age against images and against Rattrambnus, or Berto of Corbie, I think, and Gottschalk were really of slight importance. And in the fights with latter heretics, so many of whom disturbed the medieval church, old weapons were used, new ones were felt unnecessary. The task of the historian of dogma is here, therefore, very difficult. In order to know what he ought to describe to be as just to ancient dogma and its continued influence as to the new quasi-dogmatic Christianity. If my view is right, there are three lines to which we have to turn our attention. In the first place, we must examine the history of piety. I hope he's going to say the history of exegesis, Old Testament, New Testament systematics. Insofar as new tendencies with it, based on existing side by side with Augustinianism. Okay, then we'll have to call it an end there. I hope he's, I don't know, he's German. Verse 2 of this hymn by John of Damascus. Come, let us taste the vine's new fruit, for heavenly joy preparing today, the branches with the root, in resurrection sharing, whom as true God our hymns adore, forever and forevermore. Let us pray. All of the glory be to you, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.